quarantine spirit, am I right? Yeah, yeah, less stress, let your mind be free. Shift when the fog lift, you can finally see. There's a feedback loop that delay like an echo. Tune your frequency up and let go. Loud and clear is how you need to hear. And reason disappear when you feed the fear. There's a feedback loop, the warp like distortion. Keep your mind sharp like a swordsman.
Hey, Gift.
Hello.
How's it going, man?
Doing all right, man. Doing all right. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing pretty good.
Yes, sir.
It's Tuesday after a long weekend.
Fake Monday.
Fake Monday, that's it.
Fake Monday.
Fake Monday, but a hell of a fake Monday.
Yeah.
I don't know how your day was, but mine was pretty intense to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine was quite busy. I had a
Yeah.
lot of students, a lot of work because I was also off on Friday last week.
Okay.
So I had a lot to catch up.
You're one of the smart people who decided to extend their weekend and make the best of.
You know what I'm saying, man? You gotta do it right, man. You gotta do it right. Like
Yeah.
this week, I have a 3-day week as well. You
Oh,
know,
okay. Excuse me.
I'm off this Friday,
Yeah,
so
you're working those executive hours, man.
yo. You know, you gotta do
Yes.
what you gotta do.
Okay, I see how it is. You know, we don't all have these cushy jobs where we can have this flexibility to work these luxurious hours like like you get. But I get it. I see where you're at. No, actually, it's crazy because for me, I finished my Friday evening at almost 7 o'clock.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I got a call at like minutes to 5 from one of my superiors, and it was just like, I gotta run, and like him and I were kind of hashing out some details on something, and
Yeah.
then we got sidetracked by another project that I'm sort of working on, and he was asking me some questions about it, and we got onto a conversation. It was good though because
Yeah.
I got some feedback that I was kind of wanting to have on some things,
Yeah.
you know, and he's a very experienced person, so to just get his take and run things by him to see how he sees the situation, you know. So I kind of appreciate that. I regard this person as like one of my mentors, one of my few mentors that I think would
Okay.
actually be okay with me calling him a mentor.
Yeah.
You know, so
If he's
that was
watching
kind of
the
cool.
show, you know, you'll be like, so, Terry, you're quite
Uh,
fond of me.
Yeah, but if I was to invite him to watch the show, he would probably he'd probably blow off this subject. Yeah. He falls into the category that's often reproached, unfortunately. Well,
Gotcha.
I want to say unfortunately. Sometimes what I feel is that they're generalizations that are made,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes, unfortunately, too many people get lumped into a thing when sometimes they just frankly just don't care. But you know, people kind of will also
Yeah.
identify them as such and then automatically try to just overtalk them, rule them out of situations, you know? So,
Right.
yeah, challenges on both sides, I guess, on both sides of the
You
spectrum.
know? Yes, sir.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. So,
it's been an eventful past 2 weeks, I guess, with a lot of what's been going on. A lot
dude,
of big
both on the
stories
side
in
of
the
the
news.
border.
Yeah, and you know that's the thing that's crazy. Like we so often our focus is on what's going on down south, and we're just kind of sipping our Tim Hortons coffee and saying, "Geez, you know, these people are wilding down south." But meanwhile, things sometimes get out of hand here
Yeah.
in Canada, and particularly in Quebec. For those of you who may be new to the podcast, Gift and I are both in Montreal, in Quebec, and there's been some interesting stories going on recently having to do with this topic that we're bringing tonight, which is systemic racism. And we just thought that it would be interesting to kind of bring this subject to the table. We are not necessarily, the story that happened here in Quebec, we're not necessarily people of the, I guess, creed, for lack of a better term. However, one that's important to know is that for us, we're affected by systemic racism, being two black men. Actually, speaking of which, we're being joined by another black man.
Yes.
But the thing about it is that we can relate to what's going on in this situation, and we want to make sure that we address it because it affects us. All of our communities are affected, So
Yeah.
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 Just one
Yeah.
second.
It's yeah, man. It's tough. It's tough. What's been going on around the world and
Yeah.
here in Canada too. Like, I mean, it's a shame that we are not as advertised as a country.
Exactly. And the thing that's crazy about it, right, is that we like, I think we should just say it, like, sorry to say this, but hey, uh, Canada can be racist too. You know what I mean? And we like to think that we're polite and we're kind and we're accommodating, and it's not all cases. And of course, we have to say that it's not everybody. We can't generalize that everybody is racist. There are a lot of people who feel very strongly about incidents that come up in the news where they may see somebody being treated in an incorrect way and in a racist manner. And there are a lot of people who will stand up and speak up. And as polite as Canadians can be, we can also be very, very fierce about defending what we feel is correct and how we feel people should be treated. I'm going to bring Joey into the stream. Hey, Joey.
Hey.
Yes,
how's it going?
Nice to see you both.
Good to see you too, my guy.
Joey, I know I threw you a Hail Mary about being here today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making time to be with us tonight as we talk about this topic.
No problem. It's dear to my heart, this one.
Exactly. That's why I'm like, there's no better person that we can have tonight than Joey to bounce some ideas off of and look at some of these things together. So thanks for making the time.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah. So what's new with you, Joe?
Oh man, another day, another dollar. Nice
Gotta hustle.
Yeah, that's it. It's nice to have a day off and some time to relax with my kids. No rush.
Yeah.
All that.
Exactly.
Pandemic makes things kind of feel a little weird, but it also gives us a little bit of time to rest and reflect and all,
I get you. And hey, it's all about being thankful for those that are close by and everything like that. So, getting to spend time with everybody, and especially what I like about Thanksgiving. I always tell people that Thanksgiving is actually my favorite holiday, and yes, it is a bit about the food. I won't lie. But the reason why it's one of my favorite holidays is just more because of the idea of getting together with people that we love and care about and getting to spend time, so it's always important and near and dear to my heart,
Yeah.
And it doesn't make people feel awkward if they don't share your beliefs too, So,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So,
speaking of awkward,
in my family, it made.
No, I know. It's not the case.
You're all in kind of quarantine, so it was just me and the kids this time. But
yeah.
When our family did a big churchy kind of thing, but we still enjoy it anyway.
Yeah, of course. It's seeing family that's important, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So tonight's topic, man, systemic racism.
Yeah, that's not a thing.
Dumb.
Doesn't exist. It's a boogeyman, right?
I don't want you talking about
you don't want to talk about it?
Just playing victim all over the place.
Yeah. Well, have you guys ever had to like defend to somebody who just vehemently doesn't believe that it's a thing? And have you guys ever had to deal with that? I know the answer is yes.
Yeah. I've had multiple conversations with people where I had to, I felt like I put myself in the position to have to try to explain to them what it is or why we say that, But in general, it just seems like if you're not in a position to want to accept such a thing, you simply won't. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Of course. And I think it's, already as it is, like people have a difficult enough time with thinking about just racism on an interpersonal level, on a one-to-one level, right? And then now to say, no, there's entire structure systems or entire institutions that are backed, where the backbone is actually racism. That's a difficult thing for some people to accept. And it's funny because I had a talk with a friend of mine this weekend, They are a mixed couple, and we got onto the topic of systemic racism and stuff. And actually, I have to say that I appreciate very much the effort that my friend's wife is making to understand, to bring herself, like she listens to a lot of podcasts, and she's not one of those like fake woke people. She's one of those people who's like, I'm trying to understand, digest, process. And she's like, frankly, there's some things that I may not necessarily agree with, but it's not up to me to decide whether or not it's true or not. It's the people who live them,
Yeah.
who determine that. So I appreciated that
That's
she
cool.
had,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. And that's
Sounds like the
true.
ingredients of an ally.
That's true wokeness, man.
Exactly. Yeah. She fits the ally category, not the a-hole category.
That's true wokeness. It's like saying, the more I know, the less the more I realize I don't know much.
That's it. And to be honest with you, you can't ask for more than that sometimes.
Yeah.
But
that basic acknowledgement is, to me, that makes all the difference in the people I'm dealing with. Like somebody can acknowledge that and then go and make mistakes, and then I find myself in the position to be forgiving and to be helpful, under those circumstances. If it's somebody who's just adamantly just denying it because they can't get past themselves, or they can't get past the idea that they feel like they're being called racist or something like that, it's hard to get through to somebody like that.
Yeah.
Of course. And I think there needs to be a distinction made, because like there are some people that will deny, they'll be like, I'm not racist. And like sometimes we need to be trusting and accept that person is truly, despite how we may feel, because sometimes what can happen, I don't know if you guys experience this, but sometimes you become so prone or so used to feeling like there could be some sort of a racial discord with a person that like you start to generalize, and that of course in itself is not healthy. So sometimes you have to really trust that when a person says, no, I really don't think I have a racist bone. Like you got to give them the benefit of the doubt. But then you have people who do something kind of like somebody I'm going to tell you guys about a little bit later, but who will boastfully say, I have absolutely no problem, with people of different ethnic backgrounds. Meanwhile, what they're doing is they're fighting themselves to accept the truth about themselves, which is that they actually do have a problem, and I'll get into that story a little bit in a little bit, and I'll tell you guys kind of what happened to me this past weekend. So I guess what examples, for somebody who may not be familiar with what systemic racism may be, what examples or what places can we expect? Can you say that you've seen this type of stuff happen?
Right. I mean, for me, I'd say, first, my understanding of what systemic racism is a structure that discriminates against minority folks. Whether it's related to race, gender, sexuality, whatever, it's like system that is designed to discriminate against the minority.
Exactly. So, sorry, I just want to expand on that point a little bit. So to be clear, there is, yes, systemic racism is one thing, but then you can have I guess systemic homophobia can exist too, in the sense that systems may exclude people based, if you look at the institution of marriage, right, as defined by the church, it's been exclusive of people of same sex for as long as it's been around, and it's only been in recent years that things are starting to shift, But yeah, sorry, continue on your point.
Yeah. So with regards to our topic today, the system that is designed to exclude certain races or certain ethnic groups from to access whether it's resources, education, etc.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And
I would say you asked for an example, where you might see that. So I guess one obvious one to some of us is the police. How how they're implemented, how they're not necessarily set up with the tools of dealing with racial bias and targeting of people of specific race and things like that. If that's one of the ways I think systemic racism manifests itself. By being profiled based on your race.
The lack of ability sometimes to de-escalate, like in the sense that sometimes police officers may feel it's more worthwhile to de-escalate with a white person, let's say, than they would with a black person. So more than likely the black person may get arrested and then they have a criminal record. And then this criminal record can sometimes affect stuff like job opportunities, their career later on. And actually sorry, I don't mean to steal your point away from you, Joey, but when I lived in Florida, we actually had a situation where we had our bike stolen. It was a young boy who was black, and unfortunately, it was not the first time he had committed an offense. So he ended up getting caught under the 3 strikes law. And what ended up happening to him is that's the start of his life as a person with a criminal record in the United States. And that's going to affect where he can rent housing. So he can't rent in certain communities. He can't live in certain communities with homeowner associations because of the fact that he has a criminal record.
Right.
So automatically, that's also going to determine where he can send his kids to school. So even if he lives his life as a good law-abiding citizen later on in life, because he had that strike against him, that's going to have an impact on the future of his children. Potentially.
Meanwhile, that trust fund kid who I don't know rapes a girl at his fraternity party, and has got a father in a position of power, he can just get off with like a slap on the wrist and to do community service for a week and then carry on with his life, in whichever career he wants, buying homes wherever he wants, and all this.
And you see, that kind of raises a good point that we didn't even think about, like in our planning for this episode, right? But it's the fact that there's those 2 systems that exist. And unfortunately, what happens is that there's jail, and everybody thinks, okay, there's jail, there's prison. So if you commit a crime, you get locked up and that's it. But if you look at just the record at which, so if you look at the statistics at which, we tend to be processed further by the judicial system than people that are not of different that are not racial minorities or so on. It happens at such a greater rate that it sucks, right? Because we're the ones who are more likely having to deal with legal consequences a lot further. But there are people that will deny that there are 2 different systems that exist, 2 different legal systems that exist, that for people of color and that for people who are not, unfortunately.
Because there's one constitution, there's one book of laws, but they're implemented differently, and it's systemically, but they're implemented differently based on who you're prosecuting.
Exactly. And sorry, go ahead, Gil.
For me, with regards to systemic racism, I think what I can draw from is the educational system, right? Before we even get to, let's say, the policing structure or the judicial structure, even if we look from the education standpoint, from elementary to high school, there are certain types of minority groups that are perceived as more favorable than Black folks, right? And the way they're perceived in terms of intellect, right, intelligence, or what is it called? Their prospects in the future. The way the teachers sometimes may react to certain students from different backgrounds, that affects how that kid perceives themselves, right? Because the way you see yourself as a kid is also influenced by how others see you, right?
It's true, absolutely.
If you're constantly told that you're smart, you're going to continue to try to maintain that persona of being very intelligent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're always told that, like, oh, like black people are not considered smart all the time, like maybe you'd have like there's more like favorable for like, let's say, Asian folks, for example, right? Like that's a stereotype that like Asian folks are like very intelligent, good in school, studious, and if like that narrative is being fed to you, that really messes up with your with your perception, especially if, let's say, you're the only black kid in your classroom, for example.
Yeah, I agree. And if you look at even at like just how children may be treated, so like a white child may be classified as having a learning difficulty, maybe ADHD or something like that, whereas a young black child may be considered to be disruptive. And there is even incidences, like I know that in the States, I forget which month it happened and where specifically, but I know that there was like a 6-year-old girl who, she was having, she has some sort of a learning disability, and she was just not responding to the police officers. And they ended up calling, to the teachers. They ended up calling the police on a 6-year-old child and handcuffing her.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like, so then you instill this.
I saw this.
Yeah, so then you instill this trauma in a child, right, who should be just living her life, and she had a meltdown at school. Kids have meltdowns all the time, but I mean, it doesn't merit having the police called on you at 6 years old, like what type of a system do we live in, or what type of a world do we live in where that's the acceptable way to respond to a child having a meltdown, But unfortunately, it is the reality of where we live, So teachers who don't necessarily respond well, who may not fit in well in certain communities, who may already perceive black people as threats, right? They're probably more likely, if they're working in a school that's an unfavorable neighborhood, to treat the students automatically kind of like criminals rather than treat them like students, Kids who just don't want to go to class, who don't want to do their homework, and so on and so forth. Actually, on the topic of homework, since we're talking about stupid things that seem to happen to black people.
I know where you're going with this one.
There was even a girl, listen, I should have researched this, okay? But I know that there's a story. I'm sure if you Google it, okay, you can find it. But there was a girl that was sentenced to an extended period of jail time or something like that, or denied visitation rights to her family or something over homework, over not wanting to do her homework. Because she was in some sort of a juvenile detention program.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to.
Actually, that came back in the news just this week, because after all the protests and all the noise that we've been trying to make about that, they refused to let her go. So she's still in juvie right now.
She's still.
Yeah,
this is months later now.
Yeah.
Still there.
This is after the jury.
And this was because like at the end of last school year, she didn't do some assignments or something like that. I can't even remember what it made zero sense to me how it translated from she didn't accomplish her tasks to ending up in juvenile detention.
Yeah. Okay.
Like it still doesn't make any sense to me.
Sorry if I look distracted to our viewers. I'm just trying to find the information about this.
This is so exhausting, guys. Like it's getting ridiculous.
And that's the thing. So in that discussion that I was having with my friend and his wife, right, about systemic racism, that's a component that is so important to gauge, right? Is that dealing with all of these little things is so mentally heavy on us, right? Like, and I understand we all go through shit, like we all do. Okay, there's no question about it. Everybody has difficulty, and you see, that's the thing. So like my neighbor, okay, who may be a person who's not a person of color or a visible minority, okay, he struggles to pay his bills like I struggle to pay my bills, right? So that's why when something happens and him and I are making small talk, and we may talk about the topic of racism, he may ask me how I feel about a certain thing, okay, he can't necessarily, he feels like it's a non-issue because he's like, well, listen, I struggle to pay my bills too. I have a hard life too. I'm going through crap just like everybody else. So like these things happen. Right. But the problem is that there are people deliberately trying to make it difficult for people like us sometimes to get ahead. And these are the people that, fine, they may not wear a cap and gown, okay? They may not stake a burning cross on your front lawn, but these are the people who, when they see a name that they have a difficult time pronouncing in a pile of resumes, will, even though that person may be more qualified, will favor the John Smith because they could probably relate. They could see themselves having coffee with the John Smith. They can see themselves at the country club with John Smith or whatever, and they can't necessarily relate to somebody like me. I remember when I first got hired at my job, I had one guy literally tell me, like we were making small talk, and he's like, "Yeah, I love music, but I hate hip hop." And he's like, "Don't talk to me about hip hop."
Yes.
And no white person seems to realize how that they actually being racially insensitive when they say stuff like that.
Yeah, right. And sorry, I'm detracting on off of the paved road that we were trying to take with this episode, but it's true. I mean, anyways.
Yeah. I think something about systemic racism indoctrinates the people, I think, within that system, and it could even have the effect of indoctrinating the minorities that are victims of systemic racism as well, but I think it's that everything above that we mentioned, from schooling to just kind of reinforcing this this narrative that the normal people, the right people are the white people, whitewashing history so that the white people within the society can kind of have a guilt-free version of history to work with,
right?
Which has the effect of erasing us, having the effect of erasing the contributions of other cultures.
Exactly.
All of this kind of stuff feeds into it. Then you have schooling, and then you have things like, I mean, this affects us here, but I guess it's probably even more of a big deal in the States. But like municipal funded schooling creates an imbalance in public schooling. So you have a neighborhood where a poor neighborhood where people aren't earning that much to living there, and then they're going to be paying less school taxes, because it's municipal. So then the school is going to be funded less. They're going to be able to hire less, less qualified teachers, less equipment, less resources for the students. So right off the bat, if you come up in a poor neighborhood, your education is already handicapped from the start. Places, often, immigrants end up starting off in the poor neighborhoods, and in the States, poor neighborhoods. There are a lot of most Black neighborhoods are poor neighborhoods. So then that ends up having a racial element to it as well.
It
just seems like it's so deep, it's so intertwined into the system, and yet people can come up in that system and be completely unaware of it, and blind to it, if they're not experiencing it themselves.
Exactly. And actually, it's funny because I'm going to tell you guys kind of what happened to me this past weekend. So on what you just said, Joey, okay, people may deny that there's a system in place, but what can happen sometimes is when the system hasn't worked, then they question how come certain things are what they are. So I was coming home this Saturday, I ran some errands, and I bump into my next door neighbor, and I've been observing, okay? I'm a very analytical person when it comes to when I meet people up front. I try not to jump to conclusions right away, and I take things with a grain of salt. And I think that's just how I was raised as a child of West Indian parents. You don't jump too soon just because somebody says hi to you. So I pull in, and my neighbor tells me how he's been doing some research, or no, he was talking to the mayor of our municipality, and he was asking questions about the ownership of the house I live in.
What?
Exactly.
Why?
And I guess so. Here's the thing: when we first got here, when we first moved, okay, the very first thing he did was he invited us into his place, and he's like, hey, like come over for coffee, meet my wife and blah, blah, blah. We're going to be neighbors. And he said something, and red flag number one for me was, people on the street seem to have an issue with the fact that Black people were moving into this house. And I was telling them, I don't see what the problem is, like they're people just like us. What does their skin have to do with anything? Red flag one. Red flag number two.
Thanks for letting us know that that the people in our street don't want us here.
Exactly. Red flag number.
They actually had that conversation.
Red flag number two. Every time, what was it? Oh, when the George Floyd thing happened, he asked me questions about it. And he had to tell me, he had to share this very important bit of information that he had received that, they're not telling you in the news, and he sends me this. At first, he's like, what's your email address? Let me email you some facts about George Floyd that you need to know, And then I didn't give him my email address. So then the next day he hands me this folded up piece of paper, and it's a printout, some BS person who claims that they're a lawyer and how he was this and he was that, and George Floyd was an animal and that's why that's why we shouldn't be talking about him, we shouldn't be protesting and this and that. And it's like, this is a man who, he's very educated, he's an engineer, and all this stuff and whatever, but look at how gullible he is and how quick he is to jump to conclusions, without even doing proper research to really get to know like the intricacies of the situation. So that was red flag number two. Red flag number three with him was everybody in the neighborhood has a problem except him. He's the only sane person in the neighborhood. So this was like the nail in the coffin for me that kind of just said, okay, you know what? I see how this guy is. And really, when he was talking about this problem of racism, I think it's fair for me to come to the conclusion that the issue is actually with him. And for him, he doesn't understand why his neighbors have to be Black, because the system that exists should be one that excludes us from being able to afford to live next to him. You understand what I mean? And if you think about it, if you look at, and people may think that what I'm saying is
his ideas on all the other neighbors too, saying, "Oh, everybody else is uncomfortable with this." That's probably him just speaking like what his own feelings were.
Meanwhile, all the neighbors up and down the street are like, "Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you. Welcome to the neighborhood. Hey," they see the kids, they're all happy to see us and everything like that. Meanwhile, he's the person that has to act this way, but. We talk about the situation, and it may sound like it's crazy what I'm saying, but if you look at it historically, there are accounts of redlining in the United States. That was a very common practice where people would be told they would be offered a great price on a house, but a key thing, a clause almost that they had to respect was no selling to people of different ethnic groups or visible minorities, and oftentimes that just meant Black people. You know what I mean? And I remember growing up as a kid, my brother and I were the only two kids that in the condo building where my parents lived, for some reason, we couldn't play like all the other kids because we would have police called on us. You know what I mean? And it's because to them, a Black family should not be able, the system is set up to not allow Black people to live in my building. So why are there Black people in my building? And unless you have lived that as a person of color, unless you're a person who's experienced this thing, because I don't want to say that it's just Black people. I know this happens to Hispanic families, it happens to Arab families, it happens to a lot of people on the spectrum. But unless you live it yourself, you cannot understand what it is. To them, we belonged on the other side of the tracks, and we belonged with the kids who went to the crummy, rundown school with no teachers, no services, no programs. Because anyways, it doesn't matter what we became as children. It mattered what their kids could accomplish.
Yeah.
And your parents' place is right next to the tracks too.
Yeah, literally.
I remember I parked on the wrong side of the tracks a few times to come and visit to walk underneath the bridge.
That's why that expression was so real to me.
Yeah.
So I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna ask if what are your thoughts on like systemic racism within the health sector? Have you guys personally experienced it or heard someone? I mean, we know what's been happening in Montreal recently, or Quebec, but yeah.
Well, I'll let Joey go first because I talk a lot.
In the medical system, in all the ways where I'm happy to talk about my my experiences with racism, in the medical system, I've had moments where I've suspected, where I like, you know, where I felt like I haven't been taken seriously.
Mm.
But those complaints kind of seem in line with like just in general, like under those same circumstances, other people feel that same way.
Mm.
So I don't know if I've personally experienced that so much, and I haven't had spent a lot of time like, you know, having to go in and out of the medical system myself.
Mm.
But my mother has stories. You know, like I grew up with my mother having a whole slew of unique conditions. You know, she's had stories, you know, and in our family, I've had suspicions about how they've treated some of my family, like before they passed on, and you know, yeah. Personally, I don't have all my strongest stories aren't in the medical system.
Yeah.
You know?
Gotcha.
Oh, there was one time when my grandmother was my father's mother was in the hospital. I used to work at the Jewish General, and I worked in the shipping and receiving, so I delivered like parcels and boxes like throughout the hospital. And one place that I would constantly deliver to was the ICU. So before my grandmother died, she ended up in the ICU, and I'd go and deliver there, and like I was in there every day pretty much. Like I'd have my lunch break and I'd go and I would sit there, you know, and I felt like every once in a while, you know, like I just bring the order, like it has like a certain purchase order number, you know, which department it's supposed to go to. So I'd bring some things. Sometimes the courier would make mistakes and things like that. But me being the one to deliver it would have to take the wrath of whoever is supposed to sign off on the boxes, you know? So I always felt like I got some really bad attitude from the people that work there a few times. Scary.
You'll be back on track,
yeah. And I always felt like, wait, you see me here, like, you know, in tears, sitting next to my unconscious grandmother, you know, like every lunch break, after work, before I drive off home, like you see me in here. And now, but when you see me in a different context, where I'm coming in here and I'm dropping you a box, and you know, I don't know, Pure Later, mix up your order or something like that.
Yeah.
And here you are, like, you know, treating me with like utter disrespect.
Wow.
You know, especially when you see me in this context, when you know that I'm in a state of anxiety and fear and grief and all this kind of stuff already. I always felt like how can you you know, view me as a human being who hasn't really done anything to you? How can you treat me like this under these circumstances with the information you know? You know, and again, I never was certain it had anything to do with that. There's always a suspicion that there's a racial element to it, but I couldn't prove that. But that's probably the worst of it, like on my personal experience.
I don't know if I shared this story. So one personal experience I had was with my youngest daughter, Joy, when she was born. Right away, we noticed certain traits that pointed towards maybe her having a milk allergy. And I remember we, you know, it started with reflux, and one of my friends actually who had her daughter just a month before, she goes to the same clinic that we do with her kids, and right away the doctors, as soon as she said my daughter has reflux, they were ready to do all the allergy tests, the whole kit, and make sure that they identified this, and she avoided a lot of heartache. Our daughter, we spoke to our, let me just make a parenthesis here, but so my friend is Italian. In our case, we went to our doctor. We're like, well, she seems to have reflux. And our doctor right away was like, well, let's not jump to conclusions. And then our doctor was not present for a while, and she dismissed a lot of what we were saying. And then my daughter developed full-on eczema head to toe. And when we would come back with that, with all of the symptoms that she was having, dismissed it, and finally it took us going to another doctor who fortunately actually listened to us at another clinic. But imagine that we couldn't get help for our child from our clinic that we are signed up. This is the pediatrician that's following my child. And luckily we were able to get the thing resolved, but it took a lot of time. So we went 7 months with my daughter dealing with all kinds of things before we could actually get a proper allergy test to define what it is that she's allergic to. And the doctor, every time I would tell the doctor, I think we need to cut this stuff out from my wife's diet because she was breastfeeding at the time. The doctor's like, no, don't do it now, because if you do, you're going to create an allergy in your child and all this nonsense. And meanwhile, my kid is suffering.
Right.
And I don't say that lightly. I wouldn't even show you the pictures of her scratching herself because it would bother some people, because she would be covered in blood, just completely covered in blood, because she would scratch herself so violently. One story. Another story was my wife, and this is why I disappeared for a second, because I just wanted to fact check this. But when my wife's grandmother was in the hospital dying of cancer, she would go visit her. And she had a nurse ask whether she was her servant, because my wife's mother she's a black lady, but fair skin, straight hair. So she would be asked questions like, are you her servant? Are you her domestic? Son domestique, her femme de ménage or whatever. Yeah. Asked that by both a doctor and patient. So we like to think that the hospital, we tend to think of the hospital as being an institution that's above racism, that they would be probably the people to see individuals as human beings needing help and be able to put racial bias, stereotypes, and all those things aside. But unfortunately, it seems to be the case. And what brings us to this topic really, and why we've been discussing systemic racism so much in Quebec, is if we look at what's been happening in the case of Joyce Echaquan, a mother, a 37-year-old mother of 7 children, left to die in the hospital. And unfortunately, she was calling out for help, and there was the response was not even just to not respond to her, but the response it was to actually belittle her and remove dignity by insulting her because of the fact that she's a Native American lady, and we have a little clip. We have a little clip that we're going to play. This comes from CBC News, and it's kind of their report on kind of what happened in this story. So I'm just going to bring it in.
Echaquan put up this live video from her hospital bed yesterday. The mother of 7 calls out for help. The distress in her voice is obvious. You can hear other voices too. Hospital staff insulting her. Echaquan died shortly after. It's unclear how. Her family says she had gone to the hospital on Saturday with stomach pains. Her husband says now, like that, her 7 children no longer have a mother. Her death prompted calls of justice for Joyce. At this vigil outside the hospital tonight, demands for change.
This is the unacceptable event that we sadly have had to endure for so many decades.
Sadness, we're mad, we just don't understand why Native women, we have to go through that.
The chief of the Atikamekw Council of Manawan, where Echaquan was from, describes her as radiant. And says the video is audio-visual proof of systemic racism. This comes nearly a year to the day after the release of a Quebec report with 142 calls to action that found Indigenous people in the province face systemic racism when accessing public services.
She was a victim of racism.
Today, the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador released its own plan to fight that because it says the government isn't doing enough. The release of their plan today, a sad coincidence, says the Assembly's chief.
It just serves as a reminder that, I guess the mountain is steep, but we have to take it on.
Quebec Premier François Legault has repeatedly denied systemic racism exists in Quebec. Today, he said there will be investigations into Echaquan's death.
The nurses did something unacceptable and she is being fired.
The province says there will be investigations by the coroner and the health authority, but tonight there are calls to do much more than that. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Joliette, Quebec.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking, man.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to actually make a little correction. So I said Native American. I meant to say First Nations. I just want to make sure that I'm sensitive to people for if that term may not be necessarily the correct term to use. I prefer to say First Nations, but it was a slip of the tongue, unfortunately. But I do want to say that, yes, it's absolutely tragic to see something like this happen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
thankfully, she had the reflex to record what happened. She didn't even just record. Thankfully, she didn't record. She actually went live. So unfortunately, members of her family saw what was happening to her live as she was calling out for help. You know, in reports that I heard, apparently, I gotta just make sure and fact check this, but in reports that I heard, apparently the nurse even attempted to delete footage from her phone. But because it went live, she wasn't able to. You know?
Imagine the number of cases that go unreported of such abuse and such racism to, with Indigenous folks. Like, I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard about, the missing, murdered Indigenous women.
Yes.
That's been that's another issue that's been going on for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this makes me wonder on who is keeping the government accountable for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? Which basically looks at the gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, what progress has been made with regards to different related issues like suicide, mental health, just Medicare, etc. We don't hear about these things even in political campaigns as one of priorities, right? And yeah, it's painful, man, to see this, man.
Yeah, it's not a political priority because it's not what's those communities aren't the votes that they're trying to get.
Yeah,
that's true. It's unfortunate.
And then promises are made, to try to get some support from those communities, but it's a show. It's words.
Yeah, it's it's so similar to to our community, the erasure of their history, and also the silencing of their voices, right? It's it's the same thing, man, and having their lands being stripped away from them.
That's it.
That happened to our people too, yeah.
Yeah,
The type of racism faced by the First Nations people, I find, is very, it's very similar to anti-Black racism. I can, the lack of empathy that I hear in, I'd like to say average Canadian people.
Yeah.
The average Canadian, I mean, people that I know personally, even some people that I've had as close friends or family, who've gone out of their way to try to, to show that they're not racist towards Black people because they're either married in or dating a Black person in my family or, where I can see them making efforts, to speak with empathy about Black community and to try to understand what we experience and all that to more or less a degree, and have turn around and be completely sociopathic in how they refer to the First Nations people. And I've heard people that even someone very close to me you know, who was this person was a police officer, you know, and probably the majority of people that they were busting were First Nations people. You know? This person just speaks about them with venom on their tongue, and it's like the first time it stood out to me. Like I don't know if growing up, like I had heard it, and it just kind of went over my head. But I remember like I was pretty young, and the first time it kind of stood out to me, it was just kind of like my heart broke because, you know, I had such respect for this person, and then I hear them just speaking about these people as if like they're not human beings, as if they're you know, what they suffer in their community is their own doing, their own fault, you know. And turn around and blame them and say that, well, you know, get jobs, like assimilate. All you had to do was assimilate, and you'd all be fine, you know. Stop sitting and drinking your Windex, and they say like these kind of horrible things like this. And I don't know, like I've never felt like that towards those people myself, but like it keeps on surprising me, and I guess I should never be surprised by it, but you know how dark people can get. Like I mean, how dark their disconnect from First Nations people can be.
And it's easier to generalize and categorize and say, well, you know, it's just how they are, and the same way that they do it to us, you know, unfortunately. And it's a cyclical thing
happening to another group, and it's kind of like, wow, there it is, you know.
I totally agree with you, you know. And you know, so I think, you know, that's one of the key traits, right, when we think of like of what systemic racism is. It's you know, in a sense, categorization of people based on certain stereotypes. There's obviously exclusion of certain cultural groups by race or ethnicity. You know, inaccessibility to certain types of resources. You know, and if you look at especially the Native American, if you look at First Nations people, and what happens very often in their communities is that they are they have reserves that they live on, and they have, and the thing that seems like it's a nice thing to do is to create a reserve and place people and say, this is your land, here you go. But then if you don't provide the infrastructure, if you don't make certain things accessible to the people in question, like clean water, like proper living spaces and materials, building materials are super expensive, and all this stuff in their areas, then what good is it to them? Because they can't live, you know, they can't live and have access to things that we have access to, and that's why it's more difficult, you know, for them to be able to get ahead. And unfortunately, people will say, well, you know, the first argument you always hear is, well, you know, like we pay taxes and they are free of taxes when they live on the reserves. And that's such a gross just way to just kind of disqualify all of the injustice that still happens to them, you know?
That's part of the indoctrination that systemic racism does. You know, is that you have people coming up like, wow, these people, they've opted out of the system. So, you know, they get what they get. You know, they brought it on themselves. They had a chance to assimilate and become part of, you know, what we are, and adopt our values and our way of living, but they didn't. So, you know, they use that to dismiss them, you know, without acknowledging the fact that, like, hey, you came here and you took the St. Lawrence River for yourself and put them up there in the clay, and you know, like took all the best bits and left them with to survive on virtually nothing. And now, you know, 100 years later, 200 years later, 300, we're saying, well, you know, pay taxes and your problems will be all solved. I don't think so.
No, of course not. It doesn't work that way, you know. No. And then if you look at what's super accessible, it's like a whole bunch of vices that are not, you know, that create a whole bunch of dependencies, you know, and stuff like that. that's where this community is stumbling over itself. And it's the same thing that you see in our communities too. You don't see healthy, you don't see like food stores and stuff like that showing up in our neighborhoods with fresh produce. You'll see that these are oftentimes, when you go into communities that are Black communities, you'll see that the food stores don't have necessarily a lot of the same produce. You have food deserts in certain places in the United States where in Black communities, young children don't know what a tomato looks like because they've never seen a real tomato before, because their grocery store doesn't sell. They only have convenience stores. They do not have actual grocery stores, and so of course, then that's where you get situations where you have higher instances of disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, and so on, because of the fact that healthy food is not made accessible in these neighborhoods. So we have to fend for ourselves and eat junk. It's sad to see that these systems exist and that these things happen.
But liquor stores and stores that sell cigarettes just line up the communities with those. That's kind of like a joke that Dave Chappelle made, where he asked, like, "Have you ever been to the ghetto? One day, have you ever been to the ghetto when you're not expecting it?" This taxi driver got on a call and was like, "What? Like, I'm gonna be right there," and then went off his course, and he's like, "Wait," I'm like, "Where am I going?" I'm seeing gun store, liquor store, gun store, liquor store.
Yeah, but it's true.
Whose pockets is that feeding, right?
Right.
Whose pockets is that feeding?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Right.
And then you kind of feel the same way if I go to Kanawake or something. I'm like, oh, there's a lot of cigarette stores like along this little stretch of road here, and but
yeah.
And so, we've talked about like a few of the places. So obviously we've seen that like in the educational systems and stuff like that, in the health sector, oftentimes, there are racist institutions or systemic racism exists in some of these institutions, and they prevent access and growth from people of different communities, But you look at, sorry, my computer was just acting up. You look at the workforce, and it happens there too, and you look at financial institutions that will make it more difficult for certain people to access wealth and certain resources. And it's funny because I remember when I was in Florida, when I would drive through the Blacker neighborhoods, I would see check cashing places all over the place. I wouldn't see banks, and some Black people would not have bank accounts, but they would go cash their checks at a check cashing place, and then they get charged interest and everything like that, and they don't realize that they would actually make some money if they were to take their check, deposit it in an actual bank account, and so that's another way that the financial institutions actually have an impact on people of color and Black and brown people,
and that they lost a lot of trust. I think a lot of Americans, but especially Black people and people of color and minorities, I think lost trust in even the banks. Like after 2008, people had lost their whole savings, their 401ks like were cleared out, and I think it caused a lot of people to be like, you know what, I guess I'm better just cashing my check directly and putting it under my pillow or putting it in a hole in the ground than putting it on a bank, where they're gonna take risks with my money and then lose it.
Yeah.
Of course.
That's true. It's true.
Like that, the devastation, like the repercussion of that, people lost their homes. A lot of people, I'm sure, ended up homeless as a result of it.
Yeah. Man.
Of course, when you have systemic racism, anything like that impacts like the whole nation is always going to disproportionately affect the minorities.
Absolutely. So I guess a question that we should ask ourselves is, how do we cope when we see that systemic racism is present in either an institution, or when we see somebody that we care for going through a situation that really you could tell stems from a form of systemic racism? What are some of the key things, I guess, that we can do?
But for me, what I find difficult in terms of coping or dealing with systemic racism is not with like people who are completely ignorant, but it's with people who are somewhat ignorant, but they're defensive of their ignorance. You know,
Yeah.
they're like, no, I'm woke. I'm woke.
Yeah, like my neighbor.
Don't tell me I'm not woke. I got nothing more to learn from you.
I know. I mean, like, look, you know, like we have affirmative action going on here. Like, why are you complaining about being mistreated because of your race? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And I think like it's hard to I find it hard to converse with those people than those who are completely on the far right.
Yeah.
Because like they're always like trying to justify with systems that have been put into place to deflect the bias inherent within the structure.
Mhm.
And I think like what I found useful personally is like going to like the heart, basically expressing how, you know, a particular situation impacted me personally as a person, not like impacts, let's say, the Black community or like what another Black person may perceive it as, but
Mhm.
how it impacted me personally as a Black disabled person.
So like an I statement, right?
Exactly, like
I feel-
really owning up to, not saying like, you know, like this is racist for the Black community, or, you know, like this comes off as, be careful not to say this to another Black person, you know what I mean? Because
Mhm.
I feel that doesn't necessarily hit home.
Mhm.
When you personalize your experiences, I think it makes it a lot easier for someone who doesn't have lived experience or empathy to really get to a closer point to understanding where you're coming from and how that the way the system was designed is actually affecting you on a daily basis.
Yeah. I think I agree with you on that. Of course, you run the risk of, if you open yourself up in that sense, you also run the risk of being dismissed. You know what I mean? Which for me, over the course of my life, that's been like a staple. But it's like, it took like, I don't know, 30 years or something before it started bubbling over finally, and you know, like it started building up in me, that the anger of just being dismissed for those kind of things so much. You know? I personally find, like, when you're talking about kind of like people that are on the extreme right, or people that are adamant, or, you know, minds are not very likely to be changed. If they have a personal relationship with you, I think you're probably right. Like, if you can relate something, like an experience of your own, and they have a personal relationship with you, they might be able to be taken on that journey with you if you're telling them the story about it. And it might trigger some empathy. Most likely it will trigger some personal empathy. You know what I mean? But it might they might still have but you can't say that it was because of racism or systemic racism. You know, that's a one-off thing that happened to you. You know, and I'm sorry it happened to you, but you know, I'm not going to believe it's this. The people that I've had the most success of reaching in that way, I find have been women. And I think it's because in my own personal growth as a man, like growing to recognize male privilege, what it was, you know, when I was younger, like Terry, when you and I met, I had no idea male privilege didn't even, the concept wasn't even something that I even thought about, you know. Of course, being a dude, I had the privilege of not thinking about it or not being aware of it. You know? And over the course of my adult life, I discovered what it is. I discovered that I have it. I discovered in the ways in which I inadvertently perpetuate, you know, these kind of things, and make life more difficult for women, and just kind of natural, like, things like that. For me, being able to see, like, myself, like, when I draw that parallel, then I see myself as like the white person in the situation and the woman as like the Black person in the situation, where things that I do and say affect you in ways that I'm not even aware. And now you're making me aware of it.
Surely.
I'm in the position to either deny it and be like, hey, I'm woke. I believe in equality for men and women. What are you talking about? Or I can actually shut up and kind of just be like, when I said those things, this is how you felt?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I didn't realize that it had that kind of impact. I'm going to be careful about what I say in the future. I'm going to try to avoid saying things like that. And, and when I've been able to make that connection myself, I'm able to make that kind of connection with women, And
So
when
help you be empathetic.
Yeah. Like I would talk to a woman that, would have the experience of, when I don't know, when I want to go out to have a drink with my friends, my girlfriends, and, we just want to celebrate, like it's one of our birthdays or something like that. And we go out to the club and I can't walk to the bathroom without people rubbing up against me and getting a feel in or grabbing, getting like every time I'm out, I feel somebody grab at my behind or something like that. As a dude, like I never experienced that. Like it's never, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then you think, can you walk me to my car, afterward? Like it's late. I'm not really comfortable, like going to my car in this neighborhood or, like I never really have to worry about, somebody walking me to my car or feeling safe, feeling, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then I had friends who, like, they would show me. One of my friends is a journalist, and she showed me her friend's inbox versus her inbox after they both did an opinion piece on the same subject, and they both had pretty much similar things to say, and his inbox was hardly full. It had some people like responding, criticizing his arguments and this and that. And hers had people issuing death threats, commenting about her appearance, threatening to rape her. And it was full. It was all these kind of things, And she's like, we work for the same company. We, we released this on the same week. It's not like these are isolated things, but he's a dude. And the way the audience responded to him was just very different than how they responded to me. I got to filter throughout all this death threats and rape threats and comments about my appearance and I should shut up and it's not cute of me to express these things and all this. Meanwhile, he actually gets to deal with the actual content of what he's trying to talk about. And so when I talk to women about that, and I relate it to them, and I talk about like the microaggressions that they experience throughout their day. Did you go to the office? Did you feel belittled by a man at work today? Did your boss make you feel this or and they have these experiences, they can relate to them. Then you kind of bring it in and be like, well, as a person of color, we experience things too, like not the same things that you are, but like these are the things that we experience. These are the microaggressions that we have, like, I don't know, something as simple as can I touch your hair? It seems to any individual, it just seems like an innocent, like what's the big deal? But when every week of your damn life, you have to answer this question to somebody who's, looking at you as, I don't know,
as if you're a specimen, right? Not as if you're a human being.
Can I touch it? Like that. I've been asked that so many times. Whenever I let my hair grow, like white people ask me to touch their hair. No black person's ever asked me to touch my hair. You know what I mean?
That's it.
It's just a thing. Like you don't think it. Like all the men that like make this little comment or whatever, they're not thinking like, oh, like you just hurt, like. Like you're on your wit's end because you just had like 6 other men say the exact same thing to you, like on your way in today. And now I said it, and like, whoa, stop overreacting. But, people who can relate, who have like a unique experience based on who they are, whether it be gender or orientation or whatever, I find I have an easier time connecting with them and helping them to understand systemic racism. They experience something kind of systemic on their own,
Exactly. And that's it. Like you make me think of one of my good friends who, oftentimes, she's a white person, but she will relate to these topics and gets as angry about these topics as I would because of the fact that, like, she sees it, and that's the thing about it. As human beings, we need to find a place where we can relate. And I understand you may not relate with people on all things, but I don't think that gives you the right to then just dismiss, And I think having that dialogue is super important when it's a healthy one that can be had, because, and I just want to make one little point, because I think it's important that we also understand sometimes we may be very passionate and we may have a hard time actually listening to what other people may have to say in response to some of the things we will say about how we feel. And I think the only way really for us to progress and get anywhere is to also listen, as difficult as it may be at times, to just say, okay, I got this off my chest. Now I need to start to listen a bit too, to see if there's a way to get to a solution and to resolve this matter.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So,
if you want to connect, at some point, like I feel like in my life, I get to a certain point where, and my situation might be kind of unique too, because I grew up in a predominantly white community as like the person in my generation of color, and so I, like, the default for me was being silenced and not having my perspective heard, or people not being interested in hearing it or whatever. And because of that, I grew up like almost, I guess it's like it's as if it was like I grew up trained, to coddle, the dominant culture. And at some point, you get to a point where you're just like, you become aware of like how many toxic people you have around you. When it hits you, when you finally learn that like certain things are toxic, like it's not me. It was never, as a child, it wasn't something wrong with me that I was feeling the way that I was. I was in a very toxic environment, but I internalize that as like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be more like them? Why do I let these things bother me? Or at some point you get to an age where like you decide like, hey, I need to have a whole lot less toxicity in my life, and have more like people that are, that are supportive and enriching, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And my attitude has kind of started to switch very recently from like trying to give everybody a chance to just kind of being like, if there's certain behavior patterns that you're going to show, like if you respond to systemic racism a certain way, I don't have the energy anymore to invest in somebody like that, somebody who's showing some kind of willingness to like, okay, I understand that there are perspectives that I don't have, and I should value the voices of people who do have that perspective, because they're experiencing something and witnessing something that I'm missing, and I can learn from that. I'll definitely take the time with somebody who's demonstrating that kind of attitude. But if the attitude is just simply like a denial or dismissal of, what I experienced, then it's become very easy for me to just be like gone, like I'm done. I don't care if you're my auntie or if you're my, somebody that I knew from high school or what. Like if you're gonna give me that, like that the type of anxiety that comes from having people like that in your life is just not worth it anymore. And I got to take care of myself at this point.
Agreed. Yeah, for real.
Yeah,
for real. So in conclusion, gentlemen, what are any closing thoughts? Gift?
Hey man, let's keep the fight going. Don't stop. If you feel like you're being silenced by, by a certain group or a person, it's just not worth it to waste your energy on them. Just, keep doing you, and I'd say, have conversations with those who are ready to listen.
Exactly.
Don't waste your energy on those who are not ready to listen or learn or to engage in dialogue with you.
Good point.
Yeah.
I think I would say, systemic racism is something that is unlikely to disappear just because we're having more discussions about it. And unfortunately, like a lot of things, it's kind of the flavor of the month for a lot of people. A lot of different news stations and people are putting out or presenting their takes on what it is and everything like that. And in a few months' time, we'll be talking about something else. But the truth of the matter is, I think that as long as we as individuals recognize that it is something that exists, you may not necessarily, if somebody listening to this is on the other side of the fence, if you may not experience it and you may not feel that it's real, it doesn't deny its existence. And I think the important thing, like Gif has said and like Joey has said, is try to find a way to relate, because we all go through challenges in life, and I think the key thing is for us to try to remember at the end of the day that we're all human beings, and we all experience different things that are challenging to us. And just because I'm not with you to see exactly what happened to you in a specific moment doesn't deny that that's a part of the history that made you who you are. And a lot of us who are people of color are walking around carrying those experiences, having to deal with the mental weight of what systemic racism does to us as human beings. So be open, be receptive. For us in the community, we have to also be willing to have those difficult discussions and not shy away from it and own our feelings in the midst of these difficulties that we face. Because if we don't address them when we have the platform, when we have the moment to, then it's not gonna help our cause or advance our cause in any way. So that's my take on it. So on that note, go ahead, Joe. No, go.
Yeah, just to add to what you were just saying, Terry, and I also want to echo what Gift was saying, but to add to what you're saying, if you acknowledging systemic racism and acknowledging privilege is not throwing out your own experience. It's not a dismissal of your own experiences and your own struggles. It doesn't mean that you didn't work really hard to get wherever you are. It doesn't mean that you didn't face, your own Everest, your own life. It's not. I think like if everyone could just get it, understand it, anyone in a position of privilege can understand that acknowledging that is not to say that you didn't struggle yourself. It's not to say that others are better than you or people that had different struggles than you are better or anything like that. It's an acknowledgement of a reality, and in the ways in which racism affects, people of certain races, yes, everybody's got to go through certain struggles. Like it doesn't matter which race you are. You can be poor. You can have come up in an environment, I don't know, a very difficult environment in a broken home. You could have, your accomplishments might have been, at the expense of just like breaking your back, to earn your day of leisure or whatever it is. It's not to take away from any of that, but it's to just view like, okay, if we're talking about racism, a person of color might have all those things, all the same, hurdles in life that you have too, but there's another element that is impacting them, which is race, and that puts a different set of hurdles in front of them,
That's true.
If you're disabled, there's a different set of hurdles for you. And people's visceral reaction seems to be, I've often suspected that it's like why people are so adamant, like your neighbor, like he was approaching you, trying to get from you, he's trying to get you to agree with him, so that he can have that black friend that agrees and says, yeah, this is, like George Floyd is not a thing and systemic racism isn't a thing, and it appeases his sense of like, okay, like I feel valid again with,
I don't need to feel bad about myself.
Kind of separate that and just realize like, okay, it doesn't mean that, everything that all my experiences are valid. It doesn't invalidate my experiences, but I didn't have, whatever, red listing, or I didn't have redlining. I didn't have all like these specific hurdles in my way. I had other hurdles, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like that could, if that message was able to get communicated and received properly, I think it might reduce some of the defensiveness that people have, like the visceral denial.
It's true. Like you raise a very, very good point. You look at the stories of people coming through New York by means of Ellis Island, right? And the arrival of every different group of people, they went through what they went through. So the Italians went through it, the Irish went through it, and you look at the reason why the police system is so Irish in New York, and the firefighters are so Irish, and it's because they had to start getting into the police system to be able to defend themselves, from their unfortunate oppressors, who were the non-Irish Americans who took issue with them arriving in droves, and every time, like, it's silly to have to draw this parallel, but to this street was all Caucasian. The street that I lived on, it was all not ethnic, and then all of a sudden, a few brown faces started showing up, and that's what is causing this rift right now, and like you say, we do have to acknowledge each other's struggles, and it's funny because that was one of the things that my neighbor mentioned to me is his family's arrival to Canada and how they had difficulty integrating and so on and so forth, But now, if you look at him walking down the street, he just appears as a white male, right? Whereas I will walk down the same street and I'll have people pay more attention to me because I'm a black male. And what is he doing in this neighborhood? The white guy, he can pass, but not him. I don't feel so good about him being here,
Yeah.
So
on that note, you just reminded me. About a week ago, I discovered that there's a new black family that moved onto my street.
Nice. Actually,
I step out and I saw him step out, and I was just like, nod. Like it was just, it was just like a perfect nod moment. We're like a football field apart, but it was just like, saw him, and I was just like,
yeah. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because my wife was walking through our neighborhood and the same thing happened too. She met a family the other day, and the husband is, I want to say, he's French African, from where I can't recall. But then he was like, oh yeah, but there's like a bunch of different like ethnic groups on my street, and we have this family, we have a family from here, and it's like he's all excited, and my wife was like, oh, that's good. At least we may have one neighbor who's a little sketch, but at least we have some good neighbors that we can probably better identify with, not far from us.
Yeah.
So yeah. But anyhow, so I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge everybody who's joined us tonight, who's watched the episode of the podcast. Hopefully, we've enlightened you a little bit on systemic racism. Thank you, Joey, for joining us so last minute.
Yeah.
And we would like to just make sure that we keep on going. And thanks for all your support for those of you who check us out and share our videos. You guys are the reason why we do this. So thank you again, and have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks.
All right. Take it easy.
Always great to see you guys.
Likewise, guys. Take care.